Vicki J., and have the honor and pleasure of serving as the CEO for the National Alliance for Grieving Children. We are a network of childhood bereavement professionals who serve children who've had loss and change in their life. I'm joined tonight by some esteemed colleagues who have dedicated their careers to supporting children and families who've experienced a death. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tashelle Berder, who is the Assistant Professor of Human Development and Family Science at the University of Missouri, Columbia. She researches grief in marginalized communities with an emphasis in how they are often penalized for normal grief reactions, an experience that Tashelle has identified as suffocated grief. Dr. Mickey Burns is the Chief Clinical Officer at Judy's House and the JAG Institute, a comprehensive family bereavement center in Denver. In her 2 decades of experience supporting families facing adversity, Mickey has witnessed the lasting impact of unaddressed grief. She's dedicated to ensuring no child is alone in grief. Kevin Carter is the Clinical Director for the Uplift Center for Grieving Children. He directs the Family Service Program and serves as the volunteer intern coordinator and is a site leader and group facilitator for groups that are held in South Philadelphia. Kevin has worked in a range of human service and academic institutions across the country as a clinician, administrator, and educator. Welcome to each of you. My first thought is just to thank you for all the work that you've done in the past and that you're going to continue to do in the future. We are anxious to hear from you tonight. This webinar is a collaboration between 2 WPSU initiatives, Speaking Grief, which was created with philanthropic support from the New York Life Foundation, and Learning at Home, which is funded by Governor's Emergency Education Relief Grant. We look forward to including all of you in this conversation tonight. You can submit questions and comments for our experts via the chat, and we'll get to as many as time allows. We know that while important conversations about grief can be hard and they can bring up a lot of emotions in all of us. If you find yourself being triggered by this conversation tonight, you can text HOME, HOME, to 741-741 to connect with a crisis counselor free of charge 24/7. Again, that's HOME, HOME, to 741-741. To give you an idea of what you can expect tonight, we're going to touch on some basic information about recognizing children's grief, explore how misunderstandings around grief can negatively impact children, and then provide guidance on how we can support grieving children, and importantly, check in with our own grief. So we'll just get started tonight, maybe with a little one-on-one on children's grief. Mickey, I think I'll start with you. Research is a big part of what Judy's House and the JAG Institute does. So give us a sense of the scale in terms of grief. How prevalent is childhood bereavement in the United States?
Thank you, Vicki, and thank you to everybody at WPSU for having us here tonight. You know, before the pandemic, so before this incredible year that we've all just lived through, our research at Judy's House and JAG Institute told us that 1 in 14 children in the US will experience the death of a parent or a sibling by their 18th birthday. And that equates to about 5.2 million children. And so in a world where we see research studies that say about 37,000 additional children were bereaved due to COVID this year, and where we are hearing the latest coming out of the CDC that the death rate for 2020 compared to 2019 increased by 16%, which is the highest increase in the history of recording this statistic, we know that that 1 in 14 by age 18 is likely to change as we move forward.
Wow, is all I can say. You know, those statistics you shared are really specific to death, but in the world we're all living in, we know there's so many things that is causing grief right now. We're all carrying a really heavy load. So it's important to keep in mind all the other things that students may be dealing with and carrying, from a caregiver who's incarcerated, a divorce within the family unit, so many things. So it's important for us to note, especially those that are listening tonight, that if you're feeling overwhelmed, number one, you're probably not alone, but try to be gentle with yourself, give yourself grace, because you're likely carrying a lot of grief without even realizing it. It's a hard time in our country right now, and the loads are heavy on our shoulders. So Kevin, before we get any further into strategies for supporting grief, let's talk about the fundamentals, starting with how is children's grief different than adult grief? Is it different? And if so, how?
First, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight by Zoom, obviously. We know you could be doing a lot of other things. And I want to say that some days I love this question, and some days it's a little more of a challenge. So we're on those challenging days today. And I think just to begin to frame how to answer that question, we want to look at development, environment, and individual differences. So if you're looking at the difference between a child and adult, you have to really look at development. You know, what's the child's language skills? What's their understanding of death? What's their relationship to the deceased? And I see, as someone put in the chat, what if that child has had multiple deaths? So you begin to think about, it's not just the child's biology, it's really about the socialization. You start to think about, okay, so if you have a child and that child has good communication with their parent, and let's say it's a 2-year-old and the child has good communication with the parent, child might not have the words to express what their concerns are, but if that parent's able to support that child, then that grief's going to look different. The other part that I think I want to muddy up the question a little bit is that each parent has to have some kind of understanding of their own grief process. So if they were a child and the people in their family couldn't actually hold their grief, their authentic feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, then that will probably impact how that child grieves in terms of what the support looks like. So I think you want to look at where the child is developmentally, what the environment is around them. And then, as we always say in grief work, every person's grief is different. So you might have 4 children. They will have 4 different relationships with the deceased, and they're going to have 4 different ways of handling it. One might want to eat the chocolate cake that the deceased used to make, and one may hate the cake, but be wanting to hold that person's blanket because that gives them comfort. So I think if you begin to look at those 3 frames, we can have this conversation, begin to ease our way into this conversation.
Thank you, Kevin. I love it when we muddy the waters right off the bat. There's not one size fits all.
Right.
Tashelle, Mickey, anything you would add to Kevin's comment?
I think that was a very thorough answer. Thank you, Kevin. If I was going to add anything, it would just be that along that developmental trajectory, the way a child grieves at 3 is going to be different than the way they grieve at 13, and they're still potentially going to be grieving at 30. And that just evolves with us as we grow up. And so recognizing that it's a lifelong process that changes as we grow.
And the only thing I would add to this, to both to these response, and that was great, Kevin, very thorough. And Mickey, and also I'm glad to be here. Tashelle Bordier, thank you for having this panel. I might also add to that, understanding people's reactions to the child's grief responses across time, I think also shapes how they respond across time. And that might be that, that's also important to consider.
Thank you. I also think that it happens at every developmental age. So just a child has a loss at 5 and processes it as a 5-year-old, but that same loss may come up when they're at a different developmental stage, and they'll have to reprocess it with a different set of knowledge and skills. Mm-hmm. Thank you all. Mickey, often grief triggers all kinds of behaviors that in normal circumstances might be viewed as problematic. So what are some of the manifestations of grief that teachers and parents should be aware of?
It's a great question. You know, there's all the things that we think of when we think of grief. I think most people, when they think about grief, the first thing they think of is sadness and depression. And then we know, those of us who work in the field, that that's really close to worries and anxiety that come up for kids once they've lost somebody important to them. And then the longing and the loneliness of wanting to be near them. Those are some of the typical grief reactions that I think are a little more commonly known about in our society. But when we think about a child, and specifically a child in a school environment, some of the things that come up for them, the reactions, the grief reactions that they have, the emotional, physical, behavioral, and interpersonal grief reactions that may sometimes get mislabeled or be seen as acting out, are things like impaired memory and concentration, difficulty with decision making, so not being able to be planful, all of the executive functioning. So we might see decreased academic performance, attendance might start to fall off, the child may seem more disorganized, they may seem more distractible, hypervigilant, or impulsive. A lot of the areas that we typically consider ADHD can be common grief reactions as well that can really get in the way of a child's learning. And then finally, a child who really starts to withdraw, who we start to see that their interest in things that they used to find really exciting is waning, and that they don't have a lot of motivation. And when we see a child who's responding in this way, and we use some of our traditional tactics for trying to encourage them, that may not work because it's grief, and we need to be addressing their grief as opposed to helping them with a daytimer. And so those are some of the common grief reactions that sometimes get mislabeled as misbehavior in classrooms or even in our homes.
Thank you, Mickey. I spend a lot of time with younger children. So Tashelle, I have a question for you. Many times with younger children, it can look like attention or misbehaviors. And so they get in trouble at school, or we associate it with grief. But with children of color already facing a disproportionate amount of discipline in school, what does this mean for children of color who've had a loss?
Oh, wow. Another great question, Vicki. So I guess children of color are at, so this, the amount of discipline that we see occurring across the board for bereaved children in general, right? For children of all backgrounds, we know are under-acknowledged and are at risk for being penalized around normal grief reactions. They're kind of, as Mickey was speaking about a moment ago, but children of color are at risk for, that number of, that the amount of discipline is exacerbated for them, right? That the rate of expulsions, and this starts as early childhood, right? You don't have to get to high school for this to happen. Young children in early childhood programs have been literally arrested for externalizing behaviors, right? When this is done repeatedly, children start to internalize these messages that they receive, right? Which goes back to the developmental spectrum, right? Across development, people around us are social mirrors that tell us whether our behaviors are appropriate or not, right? We throughout our lives, we engage in social referencing where we're our responses are based on the responses of others, the validation or not. So when your loss is not only unrecognized but punished or penalized, you can end up internalizing these. If you're getting the same message from your first grade teacher and your fourth grade teacher and your high school teacher, getting punished each time, then you might call your grief something else, right? You might begin to mislabel your own grief and assume the label that society has imposed on you as a child who's the fighter, as the child who is ornery, right? We hear that in homes, right? It doesn't have to be in school, so we're not trying to blame schools for this, but parents and caregivers might engage in these same behaviors. The concept that I developed for that is suffocated grief, and that's where your grief is not only unacknowledged, but it gets penalized, right? You get punished for normal grief reactions, for being not engaging in the content that day because you're distracted, right? As Mickey highlighted the ways in which our memories might be impaired on an exam, and otherwise a student might skip a page on the exam and end up with a C because that person was distracted. Also, I want to highlight that, so stigma and stereotyping can be tied into reactions of parents, of caregivers, of teachers and other administrators. So you're more at risk for Black youth of color are more at risk for stereotyping, for, unacknowledged personal losses, and then unacknowledged grief around collective losses, right? The ones we're seeing that are more visible in the media right now. You come back to children are coming back to school, whether it's online learning environments or in face-to-face learning environments, with different feelings around all of the different events, different understandings of the events that are happening. They're all exposed to it. Even my 3-year-old during the George Floyd trial, as much as I tried to keep her out of it, said that her frog died because another, one of her stuffed animals squished it. And it's like, oh my goodness, so their interpretation of it, and, it comes out in their play behavior. And I'm a thanatologist, so I was really stressed. I thought I shielded her from some of this, right? While acknowledging her feelings. So, in her different reactions, she's been coloring everything in red since COVID. So the collective loss around it, and I'm wrapping up here, but I just wanted to highlight that, there is the vicarious trauma that these children are bringing into these school settings, and then they're put in these breakout rooms that are not supervised, and they're trying to talk about navigate these issues amongst themselves, and that can get tricky too, right? And then finally, I want to say one more thing. When children come back and I know that we might bring up issues related to historical losses, and I know that can be re-traumatizing for kids who are. It's not just content for kids of color, children of color. When in classrooms we're talking about these issues, historical issues with indigenous populations or slavery, any of those different things, it could be re-traumatizing for certain kids in the room, people of color, children of color, and they might be less engaged or saying less on that particular day, as well-intentioned as the teacher is. So we want to be accounting for both of those for all populations when we're trying to address this. So, and then lifelong opportunity structure. If a child keeps getting is repeatedly punished, then it means they've missed out on academics, they've missed out on social relationships, they will be further isolated by their own peers, they've been labeled implicitly or explicitly. So that then impacts career aspirations. So it's like it sends them on this just trajectory that was inappropriate because they really had a normal reaction to trauma, to loss, right? And now you don't have the job you wanted because of it, because of all of these steps that led you there. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Tashelle. We're going to switch gears a little bit and answer a couple of questions that have come in. One of them is, what is the best way to support a child whose family member has a terminal illness and does not have long to live? How do you support that child? Anybody?
Go ahead, Mickey.
My immediate answer would be to involve them, but go ahead, Mickey.
Yeah. I think involving them and being honest and transparent. A lot of times the shame and the stigma and the fear that we have as adults, we transmit that to kiddos. And when we're afraid to talk about it, when we're afraid to use words like dying or death or funeral or talking about what's going to happen afterwards, we sometimes do more harm than good. When you think about the euphemisms that we use in our world, like, we lost them. Well, if I'm a 3-year-old and you lost my mom, you better damn well go find her because you found my soccer shoes. Why can't you find my mom? Or, they've gone to a better place. Those things, those words that we use that help us to be able to ease into the conversation oftentimes make it really difficult for kids to really grasp what's going on. So when we have a kiddo in a household where somebody has a terminal illness, being able to sit down with them and talk with them about what this means, about what's going to happen. There are wonderful books out there that talk about what you see in the hospital. Hospice organizations are great at being able to prepare children for death. And so reaching out to those resources and not letting our own fear and our own grief get in the way of creating an opportunity for this to be a more holistic process for the child.
Thank you, Nikki. Another question we have in the chat is it possible for a child to grieve over something like being diagnosed with an illness or disease themselves, the loss of control over their own health? Somebody want to take that one?
The answer might be simply yes, because of just the way you asked the question. Even again, if the child doesn't have the verbal skills, they still have a body and a set of emotions that that may react and will react to the things that they may be limited. I think a lot about some families that I work with back in Florida, and a lot of what we had to pay attention to is not necessarily what the child could articulate, but again, as Tashelle and Mickey have indicated, looking at their behavior and then figuring out with the child, if the child's old enough, what all this medical stuff means, working with the physicians and working with other people to help the child understand at the level that they can understand, and then being able to optimize their living, because it might not be a terminal illness, but it might be a life-limiting illness. And I think if you go back to some of what Tashelle said, and you can mix it up even more. So, African-American children are more likely to be dealing with chronic asthma and other kinds of conditions. How does that impact, as Mickey said, their ability to be in class, their ability to get the assignments done, and then what is it that the adults in the environment will do to help compensate and support children for where they are? So it's a long-winded way of saying yes.
Thank you, Kevin. So Mickey, as kids come to school, we really don't always know, teachers may not know what all's happened in the past or what the kids are dealing with. So how can educators kind of err on the side of grief awareness, even if they don't have all the information?
I think a big piece of the role that we can play as influential individuals in a child's life is recognizing when the curriculum that we're bringing to the class, the lesson plans that we're bringing to the class have themes that are going to bring about some of those reactions that Tashelle was talking about, the re-traumatization. So looking at what are we going over in school today, and what in this day could potentially bring forth themes that are connected to grief or connected to this idea of losing something or someone special in your life and having to deal with those reactions. And then saying, okay, so if we're reading a book that's talking about the death of a pet or the death of a grandmother, how am I going to open space in my classroom to allow the students to share with me if that is something that has happened in their life? And I think we have to do that in a way where we open the space for a communal discussion in the classroom, but then we also say, a lot of kids have experienced death and loss in their lives. And if that's happened to you and you want to come talk to me about it, I'm here and you can come and we'll talk about it, so that they don't have to share with the whole class if that's not something that they're ready or willing to do. But I really think taking a really close, concentrated look at your curriculum and saying what's in here that may lead to having a child who's grieving have some of that coming forward for them as they're going through this activity, and how am I going to create space to acknowledge that, and then space to be able to allow them to have whatever reactions they're having.
Thank you, Mickey. So do you think it's important that they create space to allow that conversation, or they acknowledge it and try to figure out how to avoid the conversation?
Definitely to allow the conversation to happen. I think so much of the reluctance to talk about grief comes from us as adults and our own fear of our own loss, or as Tashelle and Kevin have said, not having had the space or having gotten messages as kids that you're just supposed to have a stiff upper lip, or that you should be able to motor through this, or even that you don't know what grief is and you just think that you're a fighter or a bad kid or all those different things. And so if we as an adult can put our own anxieties and fears on the shelves and prioritize the experience of kids, we're really going to make a difference.
Thank you. I know that seemed like a kind of obvious answer, but I wanted to make sure that, you know, we as adults know our role in making space for this. We have a very specific question. There's a teen, 13, who lost a parent recently and is not ready for counseling. She isn't ready to talk, but she needs help with anxiety. She was actually too anxious to go to school. So they started virtual school. That parent's dealing with a lot, trying to decide how to best support that teen. Any thoughts?
I want to chime in that to trust what the child is saying. Children know themselves best, and to let them lead. And that actually coincides with the previous question, that children can lead us. They can teach us about what they need if we're willing to follow and not, allow our eyes to be windows and not projectors about what they need. If the child is able to identify anxiety, there are many different aspects of grief and loss, right? It's not always the tears, a lot of the things that we might think it would be necessary, but also this child is 13, so there will be increased anxiety right now around what peers think of you. We know that adolescents are concerned about feeling different from their peers or standing out too differently. And so a lot of different things could be contributing to the anxiety that really are related to grief, but does not appear to be so because of the reactions that we're seeing. And also children, keep in mind too, if she or he or they are not speaking right now, it's a lifelong journey, and these conversations will happen as long as we have assured them that we are here for the long term to revisit these discussions across time, right? It's a developmental process. When the child is ready and feels safe to be able to talk about it, might be on, a time when you did not anticipate it would occur, that the child will be able to, they will talk about it. Also giving them multiple outlets if they may not want to talk about it. Maybe they want to text you about it. Maybe they want to write you a note about it. Maybe they want to write a poem about it. And so, this conversation that we expect, these hallmark moments, don't always occur that way. So keeping that in mind, and remembering the best gift we can offer is human presence and safety for people to be, and trust in this teen. And also maybe thinking about, if you don't know this information, as we talk today in general, I just want to say, please feel free to seek out there are a number of resources that are in this chat. I want to reinforce the importance of checking those resources out. And then also internet, we can find almost anything now. You want to know specifically about a 13-year-old and some things we might see, it might help you also be able to normalize what's going on with this teen. And keeping in mind the pandemic and so much else that is further complicating this process for them. I would say her anxiety is very normal right now, even if a loss hadn't happened, but you add that into the mix and it's challenging.
Yes.
So that's my
Thank you, Tashelle. Let's look at the other end. So a question from the chat is that someone works in a home visiting with infants and toddlers and wants to know what are some of the common reactions you can see from that age group. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think what we see in the pre-verbal kiddos, they are grieving. What we see is that they may be more irritable. They also may be more clingy. They may want to have difficulty with self-soothing. So a child who maybe in the past was able to self-soothe is now struggling for that. And so they're reaching out or yearning for more attention or affection from others. Or they may be completely reactive to any sort of touch or responsiveness from a caregiver. We also know that young children who are grieving are often looking or searching for the person who has died. And so that may look like continuing to look for things, or I think Tashelle mentioned, and Kevin did too, how we can see themes in children's play. And so looking at how they are playing, and if we're seeing changes in that, if we see much more caretaking in their play, that can be that they are saying they themselves need more tender love and care from others. But a lot of that irritability and either overly attaching or overly withdrawing are some of the things that we will see, in addition to changes in appetite and sleep for young children.
Great, thank you. So we have a lot of people. Oh, go ahead.
One thing, look at the adults. Don't just look at the child. See how the adults are managing, and that can give you some clues about perhaps the child's response. So look at that whole system around the child.
Great clue, great. So a lot of people on the call tonight are really interested in schools and how schools can support kids. So one of the questions is, should we alert the administrators of a new school that there was a loss, that, you know, or would that lead to stigmatizing and labeling the child, especially if it happened to be a child of color? Anybody?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I put that in the chat, my quick message. Yes, that was Hillary. Thanks for joining us. Yes, absolutely. You do. The reality is you do risk being stigmatized, particularly if it was a loss due to homicide or even suicide, right? There's a lot of disenfranchisement around loss. Yet it's still important because that also might provide you with an opportunity to talk about how grief is dealt with in your household, within your family. What it allows you to inform the teacher about what your child might need at a time like this, right? Like, you know, permission to, if my child gets stressed out, I give you permission to have them call me after lunch just to hear my voice. So it allows for greater collaboration when we do that, whether or not, and hopefully schools, most school missions are to support children's holistic development. So I think the risk is greater for not, even if there's stigma, and then you wait that out, but give it a chance, you know. But yeah, I definitely would infer most teachers can't provide support because they don't know the loss happened in the first place, and you don't want your child's behavior to be misinterpreted as something that is not, and also not just misinterpreted, but that they hopefully garner some type of support in that space.
Thank you. Anybody else have a thought on that? You know, they do many schools anyway, do a beginning of school assessment where you answer questions like, you know, has there been a loss? Do you need support? The teachers are carrying such a load. What are they supposed to do with that information? How do they show the best way to support the child? What is the best way? Anything that Tishelle didn't mention?
You know, Vicki, we've been doing a lot more online education this year because of the pandemic and the inability to be face-to-face with folks. And so as a kind of silver lining to the pandemic, that has allowed us to go into a number of different schools and talk with teachers and school administrators about grief, because the pandemic has also brought grief so much into the center stage. And what we've learned from that is that there's this anxiety around bringing up grief and then feeling like I don't know what to do once a child tells me that they've had somebody die or that they've had a traumatic loss. And what we try to tell teachers is all you have to do is listen. All you have to do is be curious and let that child know that they were brave and courageous for being vulnerable and sharing that with you. And that now that they've shared it, you want to know how they would like you to move forward, that you're not going to tell anybody who they wouldn't want you to unless there's a safety issue, but that together you two can decide about how you're going to get support for them, or maybe all they wanted was to let you know. And so I think the thing that I would want teachers to say is give yourself a break a little bit. You don't have to have all the answers. None of us on this call have all the answers. We rely on one another so much to be able to figure out what do we do, how do we navigate, where do we go, and how do we get this child the support they need. And so reaching out to the supports in your school and in your community can really be a way of relieving yourself of that pressure to have all the solutions in your back pocket.
Thank you. You know, I also want to just remind teachers that it's not yours to solve all the problems either. And we just heard these experts here don't have all the answers. I think as Mickey said, just, you know, sit and listen and be with the child, but also just knowing the child is dealing with a lot probably will change your perspective a little bit. And allow a little bit more patience and grace in whatever you might be seeing through them. So we have a lot of parent questions tonight. And one of my questions along the way, I'm going to read you some of the questions that they're asking on the chat, but also, how do we even, no matter what the topic or the situation is, how do we create safe spaces for safe conversations? How do we bring it up as parents? How do we start these difficult conversations to find out where the child is and to reassure them on whatever they, are dealing with? One of them is a family where there's been multiple losses, parents and grandparents in a short period of time, very unexpected. So how do I reassure my child that there will still be people around to love and support and care for you, as it appears that people are leaving, disappearing right there in front of that young child's eyes? Thoughts?
I love the question, and I think we want to pause with the top of the question first and ask, what is safety? Because we have about 109 people plus us on here, and I think if you did a question about what is safety, we would have to have 109 different answers. So I think for parents, caregivers, and adults, we need to begin to think about what that means for us, but really check that out with children. So safety for a child may be their parent not talking to them because they can't trust what their parent is going to say. But safety for the adult would be having a open, emotional, supportive conversation with the child, when in reality, it might be better for the uncle or the aunt to have that conversation, or it might be better had by referral. So I think we have to begin to investigate for ourselves and for children what safety looks like, and then we have to contextualize it. So for example, safety might be in the classroom, but as soon as you walk out the door, you might have to literally pick up a gun to get home. And that might sound extreme, but if we're going to talk about safety, the biggest thing I think adults need to do right now is to not declare safe space. I think all of us have probably said, this is a safe space. And the kids are probably looking at you like, what is she talking about? Or what is he talking about? Because we haven't defined what that is. So I think that's the first piece of work, and then negotiate that with them. Does safety mean I can be quiet? Does safety mean, can I keep the camera off? Because a lot of the youth that we work with, they don't want to be seen. And when they decide to be seen, they'll turn the camera on. And then the professionals are like, we can't see them. So it's like, safety is something that we share together, and I think we have to define it together. And we don't want to get into the whole public safety thing. We could be here for 4 hours, but I think that's just a good place to start.
That's great. Safety is often where we are too. Are we safe in the conversation? Can I be safe with myself, I guess? So there's other questions about how do we model our behavior? How do we show kids what good grief practice looks like? How do we model for them? Mickey, can you think about when and how we would share our own losses, our own feelings about the loss with a child?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me this one. We just covered this in one of my groups last night, talking about the importance of showing your reactions and all of your grief reactions to your children, because all reactions are valid. And so we want to make sure that they see that there's no bad emotions. There's a wide range of emotions. It's how we manage those reactions that can sometimes get us into difficult spots. And so first you want to communicate that you're having a grief reaction, but you're okay. I'm okay. And if you're not okay, that you're going to get the support that you need to take care of yourself. Because the last thing that we want is for a child to feel like they are responsible for your grief and for taking care of you. And so letting them know, like, hey, I'm having a rough day. Today I had a grief wave. I heard this song on the radio and it's been sticking with me. And I think I was short with you when I picked you up from school. And I'm needing to take some time in my room, and I'm just going to pray, or I'm going to read a book, or I'm going to do whatever it is that I need to do to take care of myself. So right there, we're modeling, I have reactions, I make mistakes, and I make decisions about how I manage it. And the other piece to this that comes up a lot is making sure that when we're grieving as adults and we have a household that's grieving, it can create so many new pressures. We may be worried about finances. We may be worried about our children's mental health and well-being. We may be worried about our own future, our own health problems that we might have, but that we have to, as an adult, take responsibility for those adult-size worries and let kids have responsibility for the kid-size worries. And when we're sharing our adult-size worries with our kids, we're really placing a burden on them that could be unfair. And I know that there are some households where older kids take on a lot more responsibility. And I think that is something, like Kevin said, that you negotiate within your household, because there's some households where that has to be what happens. I grew up in a family with 8 kids, and my older brothers and sisters were taking care of us a lot because that's what had to happen. And so making sure that we're not putting those adult-sized worries on our kids. And when we are calling on them to take on some adult-sized responsibilities, that we're having conversations with them about that and really being clear about how we trust them and how we are empowering them with those responsibilities.
Thank you. We have a specific question about the child who, a 6-year-old, who really seemingly is okay, functioning okay, doesn't seem to be struggling with it, but also doesn't talk about the death of his mom. And so the grandparents are asking, how much do I talk about mom? How do I bring it up? How do I know how to help him? How can I get him to tell us what he expects from us? Any thoughts?
I think at some level it goes back to, I keep going back to Tasha and Mickey, things that they've said. Trust the child at that moment, and then begin to use their level of comfort to talk about the person, not to force that on the child. Try to be as natural as possible and watch the child's reactions. I would say at Uplift Center, I think probably 25% of the calls, and I'm not sure about that statistic, but a lot of parents are calling because they're not seeing reactions. And I would say give that caregiver and that parent a lot of credit for understanding that grief can have does have significant impact on the person. So they're inquiring. So I would say stay curious and supportive, and then really reflect on, are you pushing too much? And also watch for certain kinds of behaviors. So for example, and I forget the age of the child you're referring to, but there may be some regression. Person may start wetting the bed. The child may stop eating the way that they ate before. They might not want to play. So it's really, if they've always been there for the child, stay there with the child and maybe be a little more aware of the kinds of behaviors that they're seeing, and knowing that what I think Vicki and Mickey said, it's like this is across the lifetime. I want to give an example. In Philadelphia, we're looking at, at the moment, homicides are 25% higher. But if you look back 2007, they were at the highest before now. So if those children were 3, now they're probably 17. So it's like, be patient and understand that you will probably be able to see or the child may communicate their concerns at some point. But be there, as Tasha said.
I just want to add one quick thing to that, is that sometimes children don't talk about things because they're trying to protect the parent or the caregivers, right? They don't always make their feelings known to us because they're afraid that they're going to upset you, or, so sometimes it's serving a protective function in their minds anyway, right? Cognitively for them, they might think they're doing you a solid by not sharing, right? That they're keeping you safe. So
That's
just
right.
wanted to throw that other developmental piece in.
Thank you. A lot of times it goes back to permission, just
Yeah.
giving people permission to talk and share or not share, whatever. So let's think about schools again. What are some ways that our educators and school counselors can support the communities? Kevin mentioned, gun. We have a lot of gun violence right now. So what about those communities that are affected with gun violence? What can the schools do? Not just the fact that somebody died, but just the overall feeling that this brings, the frustration, the rage, the concern for safety, all of the above.
I'm glad to jump in for that one.
I bet you are.
Kind of normalizing the rage, the anger, the fatigue that they might be experiencing from these ongoing losses. Oftentimes we see that children are dealing with, people have asked me about the pandemic. I always think, I've been highlighting that these children are dealing with a Black, and my specialty area is Black youth. I just want to clarify that, y'all. So all youth matter to me for sure. I'll give you some examples because gun violence disproportionately impacts Black males, and then gun violence related to suicide disproportionately impacts white males. So gun violence rates are high in both of those groups, actually, just impacting them differently. But opportunities to, so acknowledgement that these are normal responses. We come back to that safety piece again, and I want to reiterate what Kevin said, like, what is their definition of safety and what does that look like? But also understanding that children need breaks from feeling unsafe. And Allison says, Salam talked about that. So even if it's not physical safety, what could be your space for mental safety? Identifying people who they view as safe. So is it uncle? Is it auntie? Is it the teacher? Who can I talk to about this? And also outlets for expression about this. A simple prompt of grief is, or gun violence makes me feel, or, a simple prompt. The support of kids in these spaces does not require these, huge things, but it needs to be ongoing. So ongoing opportunities. A shooting happened in the community, acknowledge that it happens, right? Acknowledge your own impact as the educator, as the parent, right? And so, and then allowing that space. I've been in schools where they'll literally put on the board, if a student died, there'll be a RIP on the dry erase board where students just know they can come in and put a name up. They may or may not have conversation around it, but that loss was acknowledged, it was validated. And that signals this kid may need particular support. Also knowing that in any time of violent death happens, it impacts the whole community, right? We tend to go to school in the areas in which we live, and places seem to be smaller than we anticipate, right? So as particularly due to social media now, even if you know the person, it's on social media and it gets passed around. So being aware of that, children need ongoing support. That's the theme across this whole conversation today, though. But opportunities to approach it, acknowledge when this happens, because there are so many unique aspects of gun violence. There's the added layer of stigma, like suicide. There's the added layer of you did something wrong, you did something bad, fears for their own safety. Now after that, it just reinforces that could I be next? So it's hard to focus in class when you're thinking about that this pool of blood you stepped over to get to school, or that death happened on this street, on this block, even if a street memorial is put up or not, there's just constant reminders of it. So some space away from that, some mental space, some break from seeing that image that we might provide without being a therapist. Just how might we provide this, some outlet for it? Favorite song, I want to say this is a good one, y'all, if you're listening, parents or teachers or whatever, like have them, what is their playlist of songs that get them through these experiences? And it might be another song about violence, but is making them feel reinforced or validated that they get it, right? So if I always feel like, music speaks the seed of the soul, right? And you can get a lot of insight into how people are doing based on the music and songs that they're listening to. So and it's relatable for them. So there's a lot of different small things that can have long-term implications for helping them out.
Thank you, Tishelle. As you've all kind of alluded to, we are living in a society so full of heavy grief in many, many layers and levels. Much of it leads to anger and frustration and an array of emotions that are pretty strong. So what can we do to help schools understand kind of what families are dealing with, and how can we help families understand what schools are dealing with? Kevin, any thoughts?
This is a nod to our education colleagues. I think we need to acknowledge that we're asking them to do too much.
Yeah.
and I know when these questions are asked, their body probably constricts because they feel the pressure. But I think at some level, this thing needs to be turned on its head in every district in the United States of America in terms of schooling, is that this is an opportunity for everyone to get involved. So if your city council determines what happens in schools, where can we get the support in the school for them to hold the COVID transition, as well as hold all of these other multiple kinds of losses that are occurring? Because I haven't worked with a lot of school districts. I work with quite a few, but I'm assuming that because the children spend a disproportionate amount of time with them, they're holding this. And I think it's our job to allow them to scream, hear them, but then make moves. I think and many of you can relate to this. We were probably even as early as January 2020, we were we wish everyone understood more grief. And now that it's upon us, we understand that other people need to get involved. So I've heard a lot of great things about what schools can do, but the communities around them and people who have resources, people who have privilege, it's time, because it's going to impact the way our cities operate if our children can't get stabilized educational and social environments. Hopefully that didn't sound like a speech, but I'm for my school people. I wouldn't be here without them. So
I think it's okay if it sounds like a speech. It's needed. That's great. When we think about that, and I think as more and more vaccines are becoming widely available, there's kind of this anticipation that we're going to get back to normal, or at least kids are going to be going back to school soon, and there'll be this sense of normalcy. But I think there's also a knowledge we all have, whether we want to recognize it or all that, all of us, is that it's going to take a while. In all likelihood, this pandemic is going to have a long-term effect on all of us. So in terms of this upcoming school year, what sort of expectations do we have for the kids, for ourselves, as parents, as educators, as we continue to kind of navigate what COVID-19 pandemic means to each of us? Anybody?
It's funny the way that this pandemic relates so much to just the grief process that we see, and it's unique for every person, but yet it's this communal experience that we're all going through. And I think about the group members that I've known and the adults and kids that I've known who've talked to me about, I just want things to go back to normal. But ultimately what I learn is things will never go back to normal. I am fundamentally different because of this experience that I've been through. And I have to decide what I want to do with this new normal, which I actually had a group member who told me never to use that word. She's like, I hate that term. But how do I want to move forward in a world where I now have the knowledge and experience that has come out of this difficult experience that I've been through? For some, it's probably been traumatic, and for others, it's been a challenge, but we've all been going through this. And so when I come out the other side, what do I want to take with me from this experience? And what do I want to go back to that I wasn't able to do during this time? And I think that's where we really have to give ourselves grace and give ourselves time and space to not rush too quickly into having expectations that we can continue to, go to school and then go to basketball practice and come home and do homework and, be able to be there for my younger siblings or do all the things that have been expected of me when I've had this time of so much decreased activity. And so I think your question was, what expectations can we have? And mine would be to kind of let go of expectation to some extent and really say, right now, I'm just going to explore and experience and define what I want the future to be and what I want to continue with as I move into whatever post-COVID, which whenever that is, when that comes our way.
Thank you so much, Mickey.
I would add one super quick thing. Can I add one super quick thing? And that is that an idea about expectations, I would say too, some kids have actually been thriving in the pandemic. Now, I don't mean thriving by like doing exceptionally well, but some kids who are more introverted, for example, they've appreciated this online learning environment. There's some kids who struggle, but there are some people who have been able to get more done, right, under these conditions that are more quiet, less busy. And that's one group that gets disenfranchised a lot in our population, right? And then so keeping that in mind too, like we don't know. And the larger question is, how do you want to come out of the pandemic? And that, I'm curious, again, turn to these issues with curiosity. How do you want to come out of the pandemic, right? How are you using this time? How do you see yourself on the other side of this? So a future orientation is also nice too, right? So that they know this moment, no feeling is final and no experience is final, right?
That's great. So that's great. We only have a few minutes left, just a couple, but I want to assure everybody our panelists have graciously agreed to continue to answer your questions through emails. So if we didn't get to your question tonight, I apologize, but we'll get to you. And then I have one kind of overall question for each of you. So before we wrap up, what's one actionable thing that people listening right now can do to create a more grief-aware space for themselves and their children? What's one actionable thing? Am I going to have to pick you one at a time?
This will sound very corny, but have them watch the Speaking Grief documentary.
That's a great. Kevin, thank you. Nikki?
Something that's been coming up for me all night as we've been answering these questions is just the power of connection. And when we were talking about getting kids to open up about their grief, I think sometimes we jump too quickly to, hey, let's talk about this really heavy topic when we really haven't fostered connection. And connection about something as simple as like, hey, I really appreciate that you brushed your teeth this morning without me having to ask you. So really working on fostering connection so that when these difficult topics come up, there's something there for us to fall back on.
Thank you. Tashelle?
I would say honoring adversity. Acknowledging that this has not been a hard time and to do that across time. Like, I know we have the vaccine now, but we're still not in the clear. So acknowledging that, while you persevered, look at you, right? You got through this, right. And it just demonstrates how you will get through other things in this lifetime.
That's great. I would just add to kind of echo what Nikki said. It doesn't start at the point of grief. Our connections start from the beginning of a relationship, when you start having hard conversations and share emotions and feelings with each other. Thank you to each of you tonight, to Dr. Mickey Burns, to Kevin Carter, and Dr. Tashelle Bourdaire for sharing your experiences, for being so helpful and transparent and real with each of us. We appreciate you so much. I want to also thank, from the bottom of all of our heart, WPSU. The Speaking Grief Initiative has been a wonderful initiative to start conversations in our community, and we all appreciate your continuity with continuing this on. Speaking Grief was a public media initiative produced by WPSU, Penn State, with help from New York Life Foundation. And Learning at Home is a WPSU initiative also that was funded by the Governor's Emergency Education Relief. Tonight, everything that you've seen and heard will be available on the Speaking Grief website and Grief Facebook page. Our moderators have been putting that in the chat off and on throughout, so I hope that you've looked and taken note of that. Also, there have been resources of all kinds. So there's the National Alliance for Grieving Children, which has some resources in Spanish that's in the link. Kai's Journey, that was produced by New York Life and Friends, and it's a film and a book series dedicated to children and families who've experienced the death of a loved one. There's a free link in there for JAG or Judy's House for a consultation or workshop for students in school situation. And we just appreciate so much. There's also a link for a virtual caregiver workshop from Judy's House. So thank you to all that have provided resources tonight. Lastly, if you're seeking education credits, it was in the chat also, so look that up. There's a link to a survey for you to answer questions and get the credits. I would encourage you, even if you don't need the credits, to give us some feedback, fill out the survey and let us know. Thank you. Thank you. Again, I'm Vicki J. With the National Alliance for Grieving Children. I serve as the CEO, and I've been so honored to serve as the moderator of tonight's event. On behalf of me, our panelists, WPSU, and their partners, we wish all of you a safe and wonderful summer. Thank you for your interest in this topic tonight. We need more people to be talking about this. Thank you so much.